Welcome to May, Mental Health Awareness Month. Hope you join us for the next informational interview. It's a valuable resource to know about in our community. All right. Hello, everyone. I am Shannon Ortez. I am the founder and president of Light After Loss, and we are doing interviews with important community resources for Mental Health Awareness Month. Last week, we talked to Brittany Reed, who was the director of crisis response for Coleman Crisis Services. And she touched on in her interview CIT officers. So I thought that would be a good opportunity to talk about that program. So today I have Erin Ivers and Major CJ Stance with me, and I'll let them introduce themselves and where they're from. So we'll start with you, Erin. Tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from.
Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Ivers. I am from Canton originally. I work at Stark MAR, which is Stark County Mental Health and Addiction Recovery. I am the forensic coordinator and monitor, and I am also co-coordinator of our CIT program with the Crisis Intervention Team.
Awesome. And Major Stance, introduce yourself and where you're from.
Sure. My name is CJ Stance. I'm the operations commander at the Stark County Sheriff's Office. And I'm also the co-coordinator for the county with Erin for the CIT program in our county.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today, or somewhat being here virtually anyway. So we talked about CIT officers. Brittany kept bringing up that concept, if police were going to get involved in a mental health crisis, that sometimes CIT officers were called out, or if somebody called the police, to encourage them to ask for a CIT officer. So can you briefly talk about what does CIT even stand for, and what does that even mean? Either of you can jump in.
Sure. So CIT stands for Crisis Intervention Team, and CIT started in Stark County back in 2004, but CIT has been around since 1988, I believe, sometime in the 80s. But it's basically the community response, and it started as a training for law enforcement so that they would know how to respond to a behavioral health crisis call. And it's really become a partnership between law enforcement, behavioral health, and the community and the advocates, and really how we work together as a community to respond to those individuals with behavioral health needs in crisis.
Okay. And Major,
I'll jump in there. I'll jump in there a little bit.
Okay.
Unfortunately, in law enforcement, Erin said it started in 2004. We know most of our law enforcement was never trained on dealing with people with mental health issues. We were all trained on how to enforce criminal law and take people to jail. And unfortunately, that ended up putting a lot of people in jails and prisons that really didn't need to be in jails and prisons. They needed to, get medical help or mental health help. So when CIT started, we all, I guess I was one of the first classes in the county raised our hand to say that, this is something we definitely needed in our community. And it just gives the officers another tool when it comes to things that they can do instead of taking somebody in cuffs and taking them to jail, taking them to get that help that they actually need.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how you got involved? Is that you were in the very first class and then now became a coordinator? Is that how you got involved?
Yes, like I said, I was one of the first that raised my hand and wanted to be involved in that first class. And throughout the years, I've seen the positive things that training did for me, not only as a police officer, but just as a normal human being dealing with someone else that has a mental health or that's in a mental health crisis. So over the years, I've gotten more and more involved in the CIT program, and now I'm the co-coordinator for the county.
And Erin, how did you get involved?
So I came to Stark MAR about 2.5 years ago, and the best model for the CIT program throughout the country is to have that co-coordination between a law enforcement officer and a behavioral health provider. And so I got involved when the role transitioned away from just a provider agency to the board. And so that's when Major Stance and I, we got together and we became co-coordinators of the program.
Okay. Awesome. And what is typically taught in it's a 40-hour training, I believe. What is typically taught in that week that is going to help officers be more prepared to intervene in a mental health crisis?
So we cover a lot of information in that week. We cover things from just a general overview of what is a mental health crisis, what are the symptoms of behavioral health, mental health illness, so that the officers can recognize signs and symptoms when they're responding to a call. We cover substance abuse, we cover suicide, we cover verbal de-escalation skills, so that officers can actually, and they do role plays as well, so that they can actually practice the skills and things that they're learning throughout the training. They also do visits with NAMI families, which is a really important piece of the training because we really believe in helping build that empathy for the population. And so they go to and they visit NAMI families, and they also, we have a NAMI panel come in during the training to speak about their experience of, or people with lived mental health experience to kind of talk about their stories. And then the officers also go on ride-alongs with case managers from provider agencies as well, so that they kind of see the other side of things from the behavioral health standpoint of what, case managers are doing and what their days look like and how they assist people in the community as well.
Major Stance, anything to add to that? Well, I know she touched on the empathy, and I know that in law enforcement, there's things that we have to do as law enforcement officers to change that perception that we have of taking everybody to jail and not being compassionate towards others. And I think that's what we use. One of the things I talk about in this class when I get to talk to the officers is just take that a little bit extra time with these individuals that need our help, and get them the help they need instead of putting them into a jail setting.
Yeah, and I'll add too, with that, we talk a lot about community resources and things that we have in the community so that officers do understand, because there is so much in Stark County. We're very lucky and resource-rich county, really, in comparison to a lot of other places. So we have a lot of programs and things out there that a lot of people just aren't aware of. So it's so that's a lot of what we go over too in the training too, is just so officers know what resources we have available to them.
Yeah, in my personal experience, I have been involved in NAMI, and we always prompted people to ask for a CIT officer if they were going to call the police for a mental health crisis. And then I got involved in CIT and have been able to share my personal story and have been one of those NAMI families. And I still have people who are in touch with me today and say what an impact meeting people who have been through some of that stuff that everybody thinks it's going to be everybody else, and putting a face with the story and it's not the face you expect really gives kind of that huge perspective change, which I think is probably the most impactful. There's lots of good information, but hearing the stories, I think, is what people remember in some sense.
I agree, because I think that's really important too, because they hear a lot of stories of recovery and resiliency, which I think is a big part of it too, because a lot of times there's a stigma out there that, people can't recover. They're kind of just stuck. And so I think that it does make a big impact. And I agree with what you're saying.
All right. So how does an officer get chosen to do the 40-hour training? Is everybody trained? How is that? I know Major Stance, you said you raised your hand and said, I want to be involved. So how does that work? How does somebody get trained?
Well, in a perfect world, we would have every law enforcement officer trained. But unfortunately, there's so many law enforcement officers, and very few we can get in each training due to size. We do try to get the officers who make the most impact. So most of the time, we try to get those officers who are having daily contact with people on calls in the community. We also encourage our corrections officer, because we know that unfortunately there are some people with mental health that get stuck into the criminal justice system. So not only is it the deputies and the police officers that are having contact, but also our corrections staff and the even paramedics and et cetera. But we do try to get those individuals in those classes who show a interest in becoming a CIT officer and want to take that extra step and put that extra tool in the tool belt that they can use when they come into a situation where they need to use it.
So it's not, and it's open to all police departments and fire departments. It's not just Stark County Sheriff's Office. It's open to all departments, correct?
Correct. Yes,
Yes,
it's
and
open countywide.
okay.
Oh, go ahead.
And we try to get at least a few officers from each department. We reach out to those agencies to try to get everyone involved, because this is a community effort, not just a sheriff's office effort or just a Stark-Mar effort. It's a community effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have officers trained from all the agencies throughout the county. We have a very diverse group.
Perfect. All right, so say there is a mental health crisis and somebody calls 911, and we often encourage people to ask for a CIT officer if they know there is a mental health, whether it's with themselves or a family member. But I know firsthand that when you're in that moment, you don't always remember to ask for a CIT officer because you're kind of in panic. Your logical brain isn't always on track, I suppose. So how does a CIT officer get involved in a call that potentially has a mental health flare to it?
Well, we've started CIT dispatcher training, which I think is important to note, because we've started now training the dispatchers who are taking those calls so that they can recognize that this is a mental health call, and they can put it in the note that they're requesting a CIT officer, so that perhaps even if the person calling isn't asking specifically for an officer, they can recognize the signs and symptoms and put that request in for an officer.
Anything to add to that, Major Stance?
No, I was just going to touch on that same thing about our dispatchers that are now being trained to recognize someone when they're in a crisis, and taking upon themselves to send that officer who has that specialized training. So again, like Aaron said, it doesn't necessarily take them actually asking for that CIT officer, but I think our dispatchers are becoming more aware and are just automatically sending that CIT officer to that call.
Which I think is fantastic. I don't know if that was the case when I made my own call and I forgot to ask. I think I really just got lucky and did end up with a CIT officer that was on the scene who made a huge impact. If I've told my story, that's oftentimes a part of the story, is the role of the CIT officer that day. So I think it's amazing that other people, kind of the frontline people, the dispatcher, can make that decision and send out a CIT officer. Now, is a CIT officer always available?
I would say more times than not, yes.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead, CJ. In a perfect world, yes, but unfortunately that's not always the case.
Okay.
But even when they're not available, if they recognize it's a behavioral health call, they can always call mobile crisis to come out and assist. That way they still have someone who's maybe is trained with mental health, and so that they can assist the officer.
Which kind of leads to my next question. Go ahead, CJ.
I was just going to add to that. More times than not, every year we do multiple CIT classes. So we keep adding to those numbers of officers that are CIT trained throughout the county. So we would hope that most shifts, most days, there's at least one that has been trained that could respond. But like Aaron touched on, mobile crisis has been just, a valuable asset to our community, where they can actually come out and help alleviate an issue that maybe the officer doesn't have the tools to handle. So, I just want to give a shout out to the mobile crisis unit that does that every day, because we definitely really appreciate that.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question, and that's kind of why I started with mobile crisis, because they have been especially since we started the mobile response, have been so valuable in just being able to get people linked, because getting people to the crisis center or to the emergency room is a whole nother challenge. Getting people to come out has been a whole lot easier. So can you touch on, so a CIT officer goes out, but it is more, there is a significant mental health issue, maybe hospitalization, there's a safety issue. When is mobile crisis called, or even some other resources? Maybe it's not mobile crisis, but homeless hotline, or what other resources do CIT officers tap into once they're there and assess there is a need?
So when they arrive on the scene, if they don't need mobile crisis, if it's not to that level, you know, like you mentioned, Shannon, they can call homeless hotline if it's someone who's just needing housing. We have detox beds available in the community that they could always utilize as well, an alliance. We also have, what else was I going to say? CJ, if you want to jump in a second, go ahead.
Yeah, so, you know, they can call it the actual crisis center, you know, and I look at it like this, not always when an officer goes to some type of situation where they might need mobile crisis, doesn't necessarily always mean that it's a mental health issue that's going on. You know, there's people in crisis, you know, if a loved one is, you know, deceased and things like that, that might not be necessarily a mental health issue, but it's a crisis situation for that family. So there's many resources that we use with the mobile crisis that come out and talk to those families and provide them with additional resources, and maybe just that phone call to someone just to talk when they need to talk. I think is again a valuable resource for our community.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys are making this super easy, because that literally leads into my next question. A lot of times, especially if there has been an overdose, a suicide, you know, something where it's not necessarily the person who was in crisis, but it's the family who needs support. Are CIT officers trained, and how are they trained? And then do they access some of those resources like mobile crisis to support families and get them linked? Because it's not just that day, it's kind of long term that they're going to need support.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron, you want to talk about the guides that was passed out to all the law enforcement?
Which guides are you talking about?
The guides that have the numbers for, you know, mobile crisis, for, you know.
The resource cards?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have hot cards, we call them, but they have all the resources listed on them, front and back. There's an adult side and a youth side that has specific resources that officers can access for families, and families, the person themselves, whoever it may be, but there's all sorts of resources. And it is all of our provider agencies from Stark-Mar that are on there. So it's not inclusive of everything that's in Stark County, but it is a very large percentage of information out there for them.
Yeah, and it sounds like on the calls where there is, you know, a death or a loss, that mobile crisis is kind of the go-to, that they're called out to support the family and get them linked with further services. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's also, we have CISM in Stark County now too. A CISM team, Critical Incident Stress Management Team is what that stands for. And they can respond to those, you know, if there's a tragedy or some sort of event, they can respond to that as well. And they can help even the first responders who responded to that incident, family, whoever it may be.
Perfect. All right, so obviously those are difficult calls to go out to. Is there any training or support for CIT officers after the fact? They've been to a difficult call. I know it's a part of their everyday life, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact. So what support or training is offered to the officers in order to help them and support them through some of that difficult stuff that they go through?
Well, as I just kind of mentioned, that we have that CISM team, which can be a resource for them as well. But then even in our 40-hour training, part of what we touch on is that self-care piece and recognizing compassion fatigue. We we have like an advanced training, advanced CIT trainings, we call these, after the 40-hour training that officers can go to that we have. And we had someone scheduled who was going to come and talk about that self-care, compassion fatigue, things you can do to make sure that you're taking care of yourselves and dealing with that trauma that you're seeing every day on the job, and how you're dealing with that. So we are aware that that's, you know, as a first responder, they deal with a lot of things, and it's so important that they're taking care of themselves and, you know, unloading that backpack of things that they're dealing with every day. So we do offer like advanced trainings, things like that. And we try to keep just a conversation going, so that they know too, it's okay to talk about those things, and it's okay to seek help if you need it, to see a counselor, or, and I think, and CJ, you can speak to this, but I think every department has their own policy and procedures as far as that is concerned, correct?
Yeah, in most agencies, you know, we have companies that that the officers can use that's anonymous if they need to talk to somebody. But I also want to touch on, you know, those same resources that's available for the community through Stark MAR, whoever's through, those are available for the officers when they need it also. So it's not just a resource for a community, it's also a resource for the first responders.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So I will pose this to you, say, CJ, being a CIT officer and having had that training, even though it was a while ago, what is the biggest impact it made in the way you deal with calls or the community when it comes to mental health?
I always touch on empathy. You know, you just taking that extra time to see what the situation is with that person, what they're going through. I think that's, to me, the biggest thing. You know, it's easy as a police officer to throw somebody in handcuffs and take them to jail. But it's, you know, the little extra step of taking the time and figuring out what's going on and maybe not putting handcuffs on them and taking them to jail. I think that's the biggest piece that it's done for me.
And as far as data, the goal is to not incarcerate people who need more medical, mental health attention than incarceration. So I'm assuming there's data, like, has this been proven to be effective, that are more people getting the right help versus going, you know, to jail in order to address the real issue, kind of the root of the issue?
Mm-hmm. So nationally, yes, there is data that supports the CIT program and that these interventions work. In Stark County, we are really just kind of starting to collect our data because we're calling it CIT forms that officers can fill out when they're responding to a behavioral health call. And so now we can start to track that data and really kind of see how our crisis intervention, if our methods are working, so to speak, and to really back up the program and say that, yes, we have a good crisis continuum care of services here. So we are just kind of starting to collect that data now with mobile crisis and the CIT forms.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you mentioned that it is national. This is not just a Stark County kind of thing, that this is a national. A lot of communities have found the importance of CIT and training their officers to respond to mental health calls. So I'm glad that you mentioned that it's not just here. Does every county in Ohio have a CIT, or do we know?
Yes, every county in Ohio now has a CIT program.
Okay, that's good to know too. Anything to add, Major Stance?
No, and it's grown every year. It grows bigger and bigger. I think more and more individuals sees the value in CIT. It's just going to continue to grow, and we'll all get better at what we do.
How many trainings do you guys have a year now?
We do 2 full 40-hour trainings a week.
Okay. How many people in each training?
24 is the max.
Okay.
And then we do the you know, she touched on the dispatcher training, the advanced CIT training. So there's some other trainings that go along with those 2 40-hour trainings. But we definitely try to keep it. A few years we've done 3, but we definitely try to keep that 2 every year, just to continue to grow our resources in the community.
Mhm.
All right. Is there anything that I missed, I didn't ask, that you think is important to know when it comes either to the training or CIT officers, or even people who are struggling with mental health and don't know whether to call for 911 and ask for a CIT officer or mobile crisis? Anything that I missed that we should certainly mention?
Well, if I just want to add that, just so people understand, they're not alone. There's numerous individuals out there to support you. All it takes is that phone call to someone, and we'll get you the help you need.
Yeah, and I think I reiterated when I talked to Brittany is that no matter who you call, I think a lot of people get caught up in like, I don't know who to call. Call somebody, because in Stark County, we do a great job. If it's not me, I know somebody who is going to be able to help you. So if it's 911 and a CIT officer comes out and gets you linked with mobile crisis, or you call mobile crisis and you need the police or you need the homeless hotline, that no matter who you call in Stark County, we're going to get you linked with the right people. So don't get too caught up on who to call. Just call somebody. Sometimes picking up the phone and making the phone call is the hardest step, and the rest kind of just plays out on its own.
Mhm. Yeah, I would agree with
Yeah,
that. We have a very good collaborative relationship, I feel like cross system, so that no matter who you call, if you call 911 or you call mobile crisis, if it's not the right number, they'll get you connected to where you need to be.
Yeah, I have found that to
and
be.
I agree on that too.
All right. Well, I thank you guys so much for your time. I know you're super busy and appreciate everything that you guys do. And I hope to see you guys in a CIT training at some point. When is the next one? And how is that going to go?
So our next one is scheduled for August. We are still kind of figuring that out, what that's going to look like, if it'll be in person or if we'll have to get kind of creative with things. It just kind of depends on, where we're at by that time.
Yeah, it kind of changes day by day, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I hope to see you guys soon. And I hope that, goes off without a hitch, because I do think it's valuable. It's made a huge impact
Mm-hmm.
on me and my family. So I hope that you continue. You guys stay happy and healthy until then, and appreciate your time.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Aaron.
Yep, absolutely. Once again, I want to thank Aaron Ivers from Starkmar and Major CJ Stantz from the Stark County Sheriff's Office. Hope you found the information valuable. If you need Light After Loss and you've lost someone to suicide, please call our number 330-846-3630. You can also email us, lightafterlossstark@gmail.com. Our website is lightafterlossstark.com. Postvention is prevention. Give a little light if you have it. Take a little light if you need it, so nobody will ever walk in darkness. Be well.